Tonight, we drift back to a world silenced by snow, to a night when the breath of a continent turned to ice, and families across a vast, unprepared nation were sealed into their homes by a force of nature so absolute it became legend. Imagine the sound of nothing but the wind screaming against the window pane. Imagine the creeping cold, the deepening dark, and the profound, intimate drama of survival that unfolded in thousands of humble bedrooms and parlours. This is not just a story of a storm. This is the forgotten lullaby of the great blizzard of 1888, a story of how, against a roar of white fury, an entire generation was tucked in, held close, and taught how to sleep. Where in the world are you listening tonight? Are you curled up in a cosy bed in London, or perhaps watching city lights from a high-rise in Tokyo? Wherever you are, let your mind journey with us to a different night. Share in the comments below where and when you're listening. There's a unique magic in knowing we're all exploring this peaceful history together, from every corner of the globe. If this story helps you find rest, consider subscribing to Historical Truth. A simple click ensures you can return to this calm, and join us next time when we delve into another soothing chapter from the annals of time. Now, settle in. Let the outside world fade. We begin on the eve of the storm, in a city that never dreams it's about to be buried alive. The day dawned deceptively mild. In New York City on that Sunday, March 11th, 1888, the air carried a hint of spring. Crocuses, brave and foolish, poked through the earth in Washington Square. Children played in patches of lingering mud, and families strolled home from church, unburdened by heavy coats. The weather forecast in the morning papers spoke of rain and colder. A typical, manageable transition. No harbinger of apocalypse, no whisper of the historic. But far to the northwest, over the Great Lakes, two immense weather systems were beginning a fateful, slow dance. A mass of frigid Arctic air, denser than stone, was sinking south. From the Atlantic, a moisture-laden coastal storm, a prodigious child of the Gulf Stream, was swirling north. Their meeting point, plotted by no conscious will, was the burgeoning spine of the American Northeast. As families sat down to their Sunday suppers, roast beef, potatoes, stewed apples, the first fat, wet flakes began to fall in Washington, D.C. It was a novelty. Pretty. By nightfall in New York, the rain turned to sleet, ticking against the window glass like a watch counting down. In a brownstone on West 37th Street, the Henderson family finished their meal. Thomas Henderson, a clerk, peered out at the gathering slush. "A nasty night," he remarked to his wife Eleanor. "Good for nothing but bed." Their two children, 7-year-old Clara and 5-year-old William, were already in their nightshirts, their energy fading with the light. The house held the day's residual warmth, banked by the coal stove in the kitchen. Upstairs, their bedrooms were chilly but familiar. The routine was a comfort. The chamber pots slid beneath the beds, the heavy wool blankets turned down, the nightly sip of water from the ceramic pitcher. The wind was just a sound, a background murmur. But as the Hendersons slept, the dance of the giants intensified. The cold air wedge acted as a ramp, forcing the warm, wet ocean storm to rise violently over it. This explosive combination unleashed phenomenal energy. The temperature plummeted. The sleet became a blizzard of tiny crystalline ice needles, driven by winds that soon howled at over 50 miles per hour. Snow fell at a rate of an inch an hour, then 2, then 3. It did not settle gently. It was hurled horizontally, sculpting instant drifts against any vertical surface. By Monday morning, the world had vanished. Thomas Henderson rose in the grey pre-dawn and went to the window. He saw nothing but a swirling, roaring white void. The street lamps, if they still burned, were completely obscured. The familiar outlines of the neighbouring houses were gone. The silence of the night had been replaced by a constant deafening roar, the sound of the atmosphere scouring the city. He tried the front door. It opened a bare 6 inches, barred by a solid wall of densely packed snow. The shock was visceral, a cold spike of disbelief in his gut. They were entombed. Across the city, in tenements on the Lower East Side, the experience was one of immediate, desperate cold. Drafts whistled through ill-fitting windows under doors. The coal scuttle, nearly empty, became an object of profound anxiety. In grander apartments on Fifth Avenue, the chill crept up from the massive sealed windows, forming intricate frost ferns on the inside of the panes. But for every family, rich or poor, in city or farmhouse, the fundamental question shifted from what will the day bring to how will we stay warm tonight. The rhythm of life contracted to the primal pulse of shelter and hearth. The outside world ceased to exist. There was only the house, the family, and the deepening magnificent cold. The blizzard did not discriminate. Along the rural lanes of Connecticut and Massachusetts, farmers awoke to a seamless white plain. Barn roofs groaned, cows lowed in confused hunger. The connection between house and barn, often a taut guide rope, was now the only lifeline in a featureless universe. In Newark, New Jersey, a man named Albert Post would later write in his diary, "The world is reduced to the size of my parlour. The clock ticks louder. My children's breaths are small clouds. We are waiting, simply waiting for the roar to stop." And so, on that first full day of the storm, as the light remained a dim twilight at noon, the preparation for night, a night that might last for days, began in earnest. It was a slow, deliberate ritual of consolidation. Beds were stripped of their usual linens. Mattresses, heavy feather ticks or husk-filled, were dragged, slid, and pulled towards the source of heat. In most homes, this meant the kitchen stove or the fireplace in the parlour. The concept of private bedrooms, of individual cold spaces, was temporarily abandoned. Survival demanded congregation. Eleanor Henderson, with a practicality born of quiet fear, directed the operation in her home. "Bring your pillows, bring your quilts," she told Clara and William, her voice calm but firm. The children, sensing the adventure in this disruption, helped haul their thin mattresses down the narrow stairs, bumping and laughing until they reached the parlour. Thomas had already moved the settee and rug. Before the fireplace, which he kept blazing with the precious reserve of wood and coal, they created a large makeshift bed on the floor. It was a camp in the heart of their own home. This was the first universal sleep strategy of the Great Blizzard, the creation of the family bed. Not just parents and young children, but often grandparents, visiting relatives, and even, in some cases, trusted neighbours, caught away from their own homes, would share one common sleeping space on the floor, a nest of shared body heat and bundled bedding. Dignity was softened by necessity. Nightclothes were supplemented with layers, wool stockings, knitted caps, even coats laid over the blankets. The fireplace or stove became the pulsing heart of the room, its light dancing on the ceiling, its crackle a counterpoint to the demonic wind outside. As Monday wore on with no respite, the second critical element of the blizzard sleep ritual emerged, the strategic management of fuel. The fire could not go out. It was warmth. It was light. It was the spirit of the house. In the Henderson parlour, Thomas took the first watch. He would doze in an armchair pulled close to the hearth, waking every hour to feed another lump of coal or another log onto the glowing embers. The rhythm of his vigilance became the rhythm of the night. The children, curled together like puppies in their blanket fort, slept to the sound of their father's careful stoking, the shift of iron grates, the soft hiss of snow melting on the outer chimney bricks. Beyond the walls, the city was failing. Telegraph lines, the nervous system of the nation, snapped under the weight of ice and the lash of wind, plunging New York into isolation. Elevated trains stood frozen, grotesque sculptures on their tracks. Horses and their drivers, caught in the open, perished within sight of shelter. The proud modern world was proving itself a fragile shell, but inside the thousands of shell-like homes, an older, more ancient order reasserted itself. The family unit became a closed circuit of warmth and care. Stories were told, songs were sung softly, prayers were said with a new fervour. The blizzard enforced a profound intimacy. That first long night, as the wind reached its peak fury, screeching around corners, with a sound that mimicked human screams, Eleanor Henderson lay awake between her children. Clara and William slept deeply, their cheeks flushed with the fire's heat, their breaths even. The storm's rage was so immense it became, paradoxically, a blanket. There was nothing to be done, no appointment to keep, no train to catch, no duty but to remain, and to preserve the warm, sleeping forms beside her. The utter impossibility of going outside granted a strange absolute permission to rest. The world had called a halt. In that pause, guarded by a father tending his fire, sleep did not just come. It was a necessary act of faith, a tiny, warm defiance against the cold. As the firelight painted shifting shadows on the parlour ceiling, young Clara stirred in the family nest. She was warm, almost too warm, beneath the heavy layers of quilts and the shared heat of her brother. But a new sound had woven itself into the constant tapestry of the storm's roar, a sharp, intermittent crack. It sounded like a giant stepping on dry twigs, or the report of a distant rifle. "Papa," she whispered into the dim, firelit room. Thomas Henderson started from a light doze in his armchair by the hearth. "What is it, little mouse?" "The trees are breaking," Thomas listened. Sure enough, above the wind's howl came the sickening, explosive cracks of ancient limbs, and sometimes entire trunks, succumbing to the weight of the ice. The city's trees, its proud elms and oaks, were turning into crystal statues, and they were shattering. He felt a pang of sorrow for the great living things, and a sharper spike of fear. What if one fell on the roof? The sound was a reminder that their wooden fortress was vulnerable. "It's just the ice, Clara," he said, his voice a studied calm. "The trees are singing a very sad song tonight, but our house is strong. Listen to that wind. It's trying to find a way in, and it cannot." He rose, his joints stiff, and added another precious piece of coal to the fire. The orange light flared, illuminating Eleanor's watchful eyes. She was awake too. "Think of it as the storm's orchestra," Thomas continued, settling back into his chair with a soft groan. "The wind is the cello, very low and angry. The crackling ice is the percussion, and the hiss of the snow against our window, that is the violin, high and lonely." Clara considered this. She snuggled deeper into the pillow, listening now with an ear for music rather than menace. The terrifying cacophony began to separate into distinct parts. There was the deep basso profundo moan in the chimney, the frantic rattling of the shutters next door, a frantic tambourine, the distant crashes of trees, the timpani rolls, and underneath it all a constant whispery shushing like a mother quieting a child. Hush, hush, hush. This act of reframing, of turning a threat into a story, a noise into a lullaby, was happening in countless rooms that night. Imagination was a vital tool for warmth. Fear clenched muscles and burned energy. Calm conserved it. Parents became bards of the blizzard, spinning tales that transformed their reality. In a farmhouse near Deerfield, Massachusetts, a grandmother named Abigail held her 2 grandchildren close in the kitchen loft, where the heat from the cook stove rose. "This isn't just any snow," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "This is the feather snow. The old people talked of it. It falls once 100 years, soft as eiderdown, and it comes to tuck the whole world into bed. See how it covers the fields? A great white quilt. It's telling the seeds to sleep a little longer. It's telling the foxes and the hares to stay in their burrows and dream deep dreams. It's even telling the sun, 'Hush now, your turn will come again.'" The children, wide-eyed, looked at the blinding white past the window, not as a prison wall, but as a cosmic blanket tucked in by giant, gentle hands. Back in the city, the management of the night watch continued. Thomas's vigil by the fire was not merely about fuel, it was about sentinel duty. Every creak of the house, every groan of a beam under the snowload had to be assessed. The fire was a beacon in their small universe, but it was also a danger. Sparks had to be guarded against. The chimney, choked with snow, needed to draw properly to avoid a backdraft of smoke. His watch was a meditation on responsibility, a slow, quiet dance of maintenance that left no room for panic. Eleanor took over near 3 a.m. She touched his shoulder, and he relinquished the chair with a nod, staggering to the edge of the family bed to slide in beside the children. His body heat was a welcome addition to the nest. Eleanor settled into the warm hollow he had left in the chair, the wool of her shawl pulled tight. She had a different watch. Hers was inward, focused on the rhythms of her sleeping family. She listened to her husband's exhausted breaths deepen into sleep. She adjusted a blanket over William's small kicking foot. She watched the steady rise and fall of Clara's chest. Her thoughts drifted to the practicalities of the coming day. The larder, the water, the milk. They had food for a few days, but the bread was going stale. She thought of the icebox on the back porch, now likely buried and colder than ever. Perhaps the milk would keep. Water was trickier. The pipes might freeze. They had filled the bathtub and every pitcher and pot before retiring to the parlour, a small act of foresight that now felt like a triumph. But for now, in the heart of the night, her primary duty was this: to guard the sleep of her loved ones. In the cathedral of the storm, her vigil was a silent prayer. Outside, the city was a study in surreal stillness beneath the violent air. Drifts climbed to second-story windows. Streets were canyons of snow. And in the poorer quarters, the reality was grimmer. In a tenement on Mulberry Street, the Rossi family, 8 of them, huddled around a single tiny coal grate. Their fuel was scarce. Their strategy was not watchful stoking, but consolidation of heat in brief, intense periods. They would let the fire nearly die, everyone clustering together under every scrap of fabric they owned. Coats, sacks, curtains, until the cold became unbearable. Then the father would light a few precious lumps of coal, and they would crowd close for 20 minutes of blessed warmth before the cycle began again. Their sleep was fragmented, a series of cold naps between moments of fire. Yet, even here, the body sought its rhythm. The children slept most soundly in the period just after the coal was lit, when the grate glowed red and the warmth seeped into their bones, a tangible promise against the relentless chill. Dawn on Tuesday, March 13th, brought no dawn. The white darkness persisted. The storm had not slackened. The world remained erased. In the Henderson parlour, they awoke not to a new day, but to a continuation of the same endless night. The fire still burned, the wind still screamed, they were still in their camp. It was then that the true psychology of blizzard sleep began to reveal itself. The initial novelty had worn off. The adventure for the children was becoming tinged with a restless confusion. When would it end? The lack of a visible morning, the absence of the normal markers of time, the milkman's clatter, the neighbour's departure for work was deeply disorienting. The body's clock was losing its bearings. Thomas, sensing the mood, instituted a ritual. "Right," he said, stretching. "We may be snowbound, but we are not savages. We shall have breakfast, and then we shall prepare for tonight." The statement was profound. By speaking of tonight in the morning, he was reimposing a structure on timelessness. Preparation for sleep became the central organising principle of the waking hours. It gave purpose to the day. The act of airing blankets by the fire, of refilling the hot water bottles, stoneware jars wrapped in flannel, of carefully stacking the remaining fuel. These were not chores. They were sacred rites to ensure the coming night's sanctuary. And so, as the blizzard raged unabated outside, a quiet, focused domesticity thrived within. The house, once a passageway to the world, had become a self-contained universe. And at the centre of that universe's daily orbit was the imperative of the communal bed, the tended fire and the guarded collective sleep. It was a lesson in prioritization written in snow and ice. When stripped of everything else, the warmth of the family and the courage to rest were the essentials. The preparation for the second night was a more deliberate, sombre affair. The novelty had crystallized into a gritty reality. Thomas Henderson's declaration about preparing for tonight sent a ripple of purpose through the camp in the parlour. Eleanor, ever practical, took inventory. The coal scuttle was half full. The woodpile in the cellar was inaccessible, buried behind a door that opened outward against a 4-foot drift. They had the wood in the parlour basket, the kitchen chairs if it came to it, and the old newspapers for kindling. The calculation was silent but shared between them. We must be more efficient. "Children," Eleanor said, her voice adopting the tone of a benevolent quartermaster. "We have a mission. We are to build the warmest fortress in all of New York. William, you're in charge of blanket inspection." The little boy puffed out his chest, taking his duty seriously. He went from quilt to quilt, pretending to examine the stitching for holes where warmth could escape. Clara was tasked with pillow fortification, fluffing and arranging them in a semicircle closer to the hearth, creating a backrest against the chill that seeped from the walls. Thomas, meanwhile, embarked on a feat of engineering. Using a length of clothesline and some sturdy hooks he normally used for a hanging plant, he rigged a makeshift drying line across the corner of the parlour, far enough from the flames to be safe. "Dampness is the enemy," he explained, as if lecturing at a university of survival. "If our nightclothes or stockings hold any moisture, it will steal our heat while we sleep. Everything must be baked dry by the fire before nightfall." Soon socks and long johns dangled like strange limp flags, steaming gently in the heat, filling the room with the clean, woolly scent of nurtured warmth. This focus on dryness was a critical sleep strategy learned through generations of cold winters, now applied with desperate precision. In farmhouses across New England, the same scene played out. Long underwear was rotated. A set worn during the day was hung near the stove, while the set toasted from the day before was donned for the evening. Bedding was turned and aired. The very act was a declaration of order against the chaotic wetness howling outside. As afternoon deepened the grey twilight outside the window, Eleanor brought out the treasured tin of cocoa. It was a luxury, saved for special occasions. This, she decided, was the most special of occasions. She heated milk in a small pan on the fire grate, the process slow and careful, and stirred in the rich powder and a scant teaspoon of precious sugar. The aroma was transformative. It was the smell of Christmas, of safety, of childhood. As they sipped the steaming, bittersweet drink from their mugs, the mood in the room shifted. The storm was still the master of the outside, but inside they were cultivating a tiny, fragrant civilization. It was during this cocoa ritual that the stories began in earnest. Not just comforting tales, but necessary ones. Stories were a fuel as vital as coal. They distracted from hunger, the meals were becoming plainer, from fear, another tree crashed somewhere in the neighbourhood, and from the eerie, endless day. "Did I ever tell you," Thomas began, settling back with his mug, "about the winter of the Great Silence? It was when my grandfather was a boy, even before the trains came." Clara and William leaned in, their eyes reflecting the firelight. "It wasn't a blizzard like this," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a storyteller's cadence. "It was so cold and so still that the snow fell straight down for a week. No wind at all. It piled up so high it covered the first-floor windows of their farmhouse. But the strange thing was the silence. It was so thick you could hear your own heart beat. They said you could hear a fox breathing in its den 50 yards away. And at night, the cold made the logs in the walls crack so loud it sounded like gunshots." "Were they scared?" William whispered. "A little," Thomas admitted. "But they had a trick. My great-grandfather told them that the cracking wasn't the house breaking, it was the house talking. He said the old timbers, the pine and the oak had memories of being trees in the sun. The intense cold made them remember, and they were whispering their memories to each other. A creak was the memory of a sunny day. A loud pop was the memory of a squirrel running along the branch. So at night, instead of being frightened by the noises, they would lie in bed and try to listen to the stories the house was telling. And they slept like logs themselves. The children were enchanted. That night, as they lay in their blanket nest, every groan of the brownstone's beams, every tick of contracting plaster, became part of a narrative. The house was no longer just shelter. It was a companion, an elder sharing its long history of weathering storms. This anthropomorphism of the home was a widespread psychological balm. In a brownstone in Brooklyn, a mother told her children the wind was trying to sing them a song but hadn't learned the words yet, so it just roared the tune. In a Connecticut farmhouse, a father claimed the drifts were protective walls built by invisible snow elves to keep the wolves of the wind at bay. The enemy outside was given character, motive, even a kind of clumsy intent. This made it less of an abstract, terrifying force and more of a manageable, if formidable, opponent. As true darkness fell on Tuesday night, a darkness felt more than seen, as the white void beyond the windows finally turned black. The Henderson family enacted their new, improved sleep ritual. The aired, bone-dry clothes were donned. The stoneware hot water bottles, refilled from the kettle and wrapped in flannel sleeves, were placed at the foot of the bedroll. Thomas had devised a rotation for the watch, drawing a crude clock on a piece of paper and marking shifts. Eleanor would take the first, he the deep hours after midnight, and Clara, feeling immensely grown up, was given the dawn watch, from 5 o'clock onward, with strict instructions to wake Papa if the fire grew too low. The granting of responsibility was a masterstroke. It made Clara a stakeholder in the safety of the night. Her sleep before her watch was light, eager, attuned to the passing of time in a way she had never been. When Eleanor gently shook her shoulder in the pre-dawn blackness, the little girl sat up immediately, wrapped in a quilt, and took her place in the chair. She stared at the glowing coals with the fierce concentration of a priestess tending a sacred flame. The immense sleeping forms of her family were her congregation. The slow, soft breath of the storm was her hymn. In that quiet hour she was not a child in a storm, she was a guardian of the hearth, and in that weight of purpose she found a deep, profound calm. The blizzard, unknowingly, was teaching them all a forgotten art, the art of focused, communal vigilance that led not to anxiety, but to a kind of peace. The world had shrunk to a single room, a single fire, a single shared breath. And in that simplified existence, sleep became not an escape, but the central honoured act of faith. Wednesday, March 14th. A ghost of light, pale and diluted, strained through the ice-caked parlour window. The wind, for the first time in 48 hours, showed signs of exhaustion. Its scream had lowered to a sustained, grieving moan. The snowfall had lessened from a furious horizontal scour to a gentle, almost apologetic vertical descent. The change was felt before it was seen, a slight easing of pressure in the ears, a minute softening of the constant vibration in the floorboards. Thomas Henderson woke to Clara's small hand on his arm. "Papa," she whispered, "my watch is over. The fire is good. And listen." He listened. Beyond the crackle of the hearth there was a new quality to the silence. The murderous edge was gone. The world was not quiet, but it was no longer being actively torn apart. He rose stiffly, every muscle protesting from nights in a chair and on the floor, and went to the window. Using the edge of his palm, he melted a small porthole in the thick frost on the glass. What he saw was an alien landscape. Their familiar street was gone. In its place was a series of soft, sculpted dunes, seamless and blinding white. The tops of hansom cabs were barely visible, like shipwrecks in an Arctic sea. A single telegraph pole leaned at a drunken angle, its wires severed and trailing into the snow. The silence outside was profound, a blanket of muffled awe. The storm had not stopped. It was resting, and in its rest it had left a transformed planet. "The wind has gone to sleep," William announced, peering from the nest of blankets. The metaphor was perfect. The frantic, violent activity was over. Now the world itself seemed to be under a deep white duvet. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The siege was lifting. But with the easing of the immediate threat came a new wave of reality. They were buried. The city was paralysed, and they were still confined, now not by fury, but by a vast soft inertia. This transitional period introduced a new phase of blizzard sleep. The sleep of recovery, laced with anticipation. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the peak of the crisis began to ebb, leaving behind a deep, bodily fatigue. Yet the mind was now active, plotting, wondering about the outside world. Would there be food? Could they dig out? When would the trains run? Eleanor felt this shift keenly. "We must conserve our energy," she said, as they ate a breakfast of stale bread toasted by the fire and the last of the apples. "The digging will be ferocious work. Today we rest. We prepare. We sleep in the daylight if we can." The concept of a daytime nap, once a luxury or a sign of illness, was now a strategic necessity. But sleeping during the suddenly bright, snow-reflected light was strange. The quality of the silence was different too, expectant, holding its breath. To adapt, they employed the oldest trick in the book. They recreated night. In the Henderson parlour, they hung heavy horse blankets over the windows, pinning them with books. The blazing fire, no longer needed purely for survival, became a source of comforting, faux evening ambience. Thomas declared it a repose. They would all lie down in the warm gloom of their makeshift bedroom and try to sleep, not because the storm demanded it, but because their bodies needed to bank strength for the labour to come. For the children, this was a delightful game. For Thomas and Eleanor, it was a discipline. Lying down in the quiet with the imminent threat removed allowed all the suppressed worries to surface, the accounts at work, the health of relatives they couldn't contact, the cost of replacing lost fuel. Eleanor's mind raced with lists. Thomas calculated the cubic feet of snow between their front door and the street. Yet the shared rhythm of their breathing in the dark room, the warmth of the children nestled between them, the crackle of the fire, these sensory anchors worked their slow magic. They were practicing a form of sleep that farmers and soldiers have known for millennia, the rest taken not at the end of labour, but in preparation for it. It was a deliberate, conscious surrender, a way of telling the body, store this, you will need it soon. Across the buried city, similar scenes unfolded. In tenements, where the cold was still a sharp-clawed companion, families who had endured fragmented, fearful sleep now collapsed into deep, heavy slumber in the relative calm, piled together for warmth, their exhaustion finally claiming them fully. In the grand houses of the wealthy, where coal supplies were larger but the rooms vaster, families retreated to libraries or smaller sitting rooms, creating intimate, firelit caves for collective daytime rest. The snow, in its new stillness, became a natural sound barrier. The usual clamour of the city, horse hooves, street vendors, bells, was utterly absent. This absolute quiet was, for many urban dwellers, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It was a silence so deep it had a texture, a weight, and within that weight sleep became deeper, more profound. The mind, free from the constant low-grade assault of noise, could truly drift. Dreams were reported to be vivid, strange, and often filled with landscapes of white or imagery of quiet enclosed spaces. As the Hendersons dozed that Wednesday afternoon, their sleep was not the alert, watchful rest of the previous nights. It was the sleep of creatures in a den after a long hunt. It was restorative. Clara dreamed she was a rabbit in a warm, dark warren, listening to the roots of the world grow. Thomas dreamed of shoveling not snow but feathers, great mountains of them that floated away as soon as he touched them. When they awoke, groggy and disoriented in the firelit gloom, it was with a sense of stored strength. The blizzard's legacy was no longer just a story of survival, but a lesson in the rhythm of endurance, crisis, watchfulness, the calm after the storm, and the intentional strategic rest that bridged one trial and the next. The great sleeping world outside their window was no longer an enemy. It was a shared condition, a pause in the machinery of life, and in that pause they had rediscovered the ancient essential art of lying still, together, and gathering strength from the quiet. The soft, post-storm quiet was broken by a new sound, the scrape-scrape thud of a shovel. It came from somewhere down the block, muffled but unmistakable, the first determined heartbeat of the city struggling back to life. Thomas Henderson heard it as he emerged from his deep daytime sleep. It was a call to action. He rose, his muscles stiff but his mind clear. The strategic rest was over. The labour phase had begun. He parted the horse blanket over the window. The light was dazzling, reflecting off 1,000,000,000,000 icy facets. Men, looking like tiny dark ants against an endless sugar mound, were already atop the drifts, digging downward towards their front doors. Smoke began to curl from a few chimneys down the street. Others had succeeded in forging a path to their coal sheds. "Right," Thomas said, turning to his family. "The world is waking up. We must dig our door. But we must be wise. We will work in shifts. No one exhausts themselves. And tonight—" He paused, looking at their camp in the parlour, the blankets rumpled, the pillows flattened. "Tonight, we may attempt to sleep in our own beds." A small, complicated thrill went through the room. The idea of their own beds, their own rooms, felt like a distant memory of a lost civilization. It was the promise of normalcy. But it was also a prospect now tinged with strange anxiety. The parlour camp, for all its improvisation, had become a safe, warm cocoon. The upstairs bedrooms, untouched by fire for 3 days, would be Arctic. The return to normality would be a new challenge. This was the next subtle evolution of blizzard sleep, the transition back to routine, which was itself an arduous journey. The sleep of recovery now had a direct purpose, to fuel the physical toil of reclamation. And the promised reward was a return to private, familiar spaces, but those spaces were now enemy territory, conquered by the cold. Thomas and Eleanor devised a plan. While Thomas began the Herculean task of digging out the front door and a path to the coal cellar, Eleanor and the children would undertake Operation Bedroom Reconnaissance. Their mission, to assess the frigid state of the upstairs and begin the slow process of making it habitable for the night. Armed with a coal scuttle of embers from the parlour fire in a metal bucket, and every spare blanket they could carry, the trio ascended the stairs. The temperature drop was shocking. Their breath plumed visibly in the grey light filtering through the frost-encased windows. Clara's bedroom felt like a cavern of ice. The wallpaper seemed brittle. The water in her wash-basin pitcher was a solid block. "We shall be like explorers," Eleanor declared, her voice brisk to hide her own dismay. "We are bringing fire to the ice palace." They placed the bucket of embers carefully on the tile hearth in the parents' bedroom, where it glowed like a sullen miniature sun, doing little to heat the air but serving as a psychological beacon. Then they began the process of nesting. They stripped the beds of their cold linens and brought down all the blankets and quilts to be warmed by the parlour fire. They would rotate them, a set warming below while they worked, then carried up to make the beds later. The stoneware hot water bottles became crucial weapons in this campaign. Once the downstairs kettle boiled, they would be filled and placed deep within the beds an hour before bedtime, a tiny kernel of heat in a vast cold expanse. Downstairs, Thomas's shovel met not just snow, but a dense granular compound of snow, ice and frozen filth from the street. It was back-breaking work. Each shovelful had to be thrown high to clear the towering walls of the path he was creating. After 20 minutes, he was sweating inside his coat, a dangerous state in the freezing air. He came inside, flushed and panting, to shed a layer and drink water. "You see," he said to William, who watched with awe, "the storm is still fighting us. It has left its army behind. We must defeat it one shovelful at a time." The metaphor of battle gave the drudgery meaning. They were not just clearing snow, they were reclaiming their territory from the occupying force of winter. By late afternoon, Thomas had carved a narrow canyon to the street, and a separate tunnel to the coal cellar door. The sight of the ordinary cobbled street cleared in a small patch was exhilarating. Neighbours called to each other from their respective canyon rims, their voices echoing strangely. In the white labyrinth, news was exchanged in shouted snippets. "The telegraph wires are all down. Heard a horse froze on Fifth Avenue. Have you got milk?" The shared struggle bred a powerful camaraderie. It also bred a new kind of exhaustion, a clean, physical weariness that was entirely different from the nervous depletion of the storm's peak. This was the exhaustion of muscles, not of nerves, and it came with a powerful ally, appetite. They ate a hearty stew that Eleanor had simmered for hours by the fire, the smell of which had taunted them all day. The hot food settled in their bellies like a blessing. As dusk fell on Wednesday, the Hendersons faced their moment of truth. The upstairs bedrooms were still cold, but the beds were now made with blankets that had been toasted by the fire all afternoon. 4 stoneware bottles wrapped in flannel were already buried beneath the covers like hidden treasures. "We shall be pioneers," Thomas announced, lighting an oil lamp. "We are returning to our lands, but we shall be prepared." The nightly ritual adapted once more. They wore their extra layers, stockings, caps, even lightweight coats over their nightclothes. They said their good nights not in the cosy parlour, but at the foot of the icy stairs, a small procession bearing lamps and final warm bricks from the fire wrapped in towels. Clara climbed into her bed. The sheets were chilling to the touch, but as she stretched her feet down, she found the glowing warmth of the stone bottle. She curled around it like a comma. The room was vast and dark, the shadows leaping in the lamplight. The familiar shapes of her dresser and toy chest were strange, shrouded in deep cold. She missed the sound of her family's breathing close by. But then, from her parents' room next door, she heard her father's voice, just loud enough to carry. "Good night, explorers. Report on your ice palace in the morning." And from William's room across the hall, a small brave voice replied, "The ice is melting. Good night." They were separate but connected. The house was still a united front. The blizzard had taught them to share warmth, and now, even in their private cold rooms, they held on to the memory of that shared heat. Clara fell asleep not to the roar of wind, but to the deep, familiar silence of her own room, a silence she now appreciated, and the faint, reassuring knowledge that her family's warmth was just through the wall, a whisper away. The cold of the reclaimed bedrooms was a profound, deep space cold. It did not bite. It enveloped. Clara, waking in the deep night, found the stoneware bottle at her feet had surrendered its heat, becoming just a smooth, cool weight. The air in the room felt thick and glassy. She lay still, listening. The house was alive with a new symphony of sounds now that the storm's roar was gone. The sharp ping of contracting metal in the eaves, the groan of timber adjusting to the sudden, immense weight of snow on the roof, the endless faint trickle of meltwater beginning somewhere in the walls. But beneath these sounds there was something else. A human sound. A soft, rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from her parents' room. Curiosity overpowered the cold. She slipped from her bed, the floorboards like ice under her stockinged feet, and padded to their door, pushing it open a crack. By the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow world outside the window, she saw her father. He was not in bed. He was sitting in the rocking chair by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a mountain of blankets. In his hands was a small sharp knife and a block of wood. The scratch-scratch was the sound of the blade carefully shaping the wood. A single candle burned on the bedside table, painting his focused face in warm, dancing light. "Papa?" she whispered. He looked up, not startled. "Couldn't sleep, little mouse?" "It's very cold. What are you doing?" "Carving a talisman," he said softly, holding up the block. It was beginning to take the shape of a stout little horse, its legs curled beneath it as if lying down. "For the house. My grandfather believed that a house needed a sleep guardian after a great trial, something carved in the heart of the trouble to watch over the dreams that come after." He resumed his careful scraping. Clara came closer, drawn by the candle's pool of warmth and the hypnotic, gentle sound of the carving. "Why a horse?" "Because horses are strong," Thomas murmured, his eyes on his work. "And they sleep standing up, always watchful. But this one is lying down. It's a horse that knows its watch is over. It's a horse that can finally rest." He blew wood dust from the figure. "It will hold the memory of these past nights, the memory of how we all slept together and watched over each other, so that in future winters, when the wind blows, the house will remember that it kept us safe, and it will be confident in its strength." This act of creation, this deliberate crafting of a memory into an object, was a powerful psychological tool. It was an act of closure and of prophecy. The blizzard was being processed, not just endured. By carving the sleep guardian, Thomas was externalizing the vigilance of the past days, setting it in wood so that his own mind could be released from its sentinel duty. He was, in essence, carving permission to sleep deeply again. Clara watched, mesmerized, until her eyes grew heavy. The rhythmic scratching was more effective than any lullaby. It was the sound of order being imposed on chaos, of a story being given form. Thomas noticed her drooping head. "Back to bed, explorer," he said gently. "Take this." He handed her the warm brick from his own blanket wrap, having swapped it for the cooled one at his feet. "Tell the ice palace the guardian is nearly ready." Clara padded back to her room, the brick a comforting weight, in her arms. She slipped it under her covers and climbed in. The memory of her father, calm and crating in the candlelight, filled the cold room with an invisible warmth. The scratch-scratch continued for a while, a faint, reassuring heartbeat in the night before it stopped. She heard the soft creak of the rocking chair as he finally rose and went to bed. In other homes across the city, similar rituals of processing were underway. Diaries were being written by candlelight, the frantic scribbles of the storm's peak giving way to more reflective passages. "We have come through," wrote Albert Post in Newark. "The children sleep in their own beds, looking like angels in the moonlight. The house is so quiet I can hear the snow settling on the roof. It is a good sound. Women stitched by the last of the coal fires, mending tears, but also perhaps adding a new, dense pattern to a quilt. A snowflake, a pine tree buried in snow, a silent testament woven into the family's fabric." The sleep that followed these acts of creation was different from the exhausted collapse of the afternoon, or the watchful rest of the storm. It was a sleep of integration. The mind and body, having been through an extraordinary event, were now weaving that experience into the tapestry of memory, making it part of their story. Dreams that night were often consolidating dreams, replaying events, but with a sense of safety, of looking back from a place of security. Thomas Henderson finished his little horse as the first true grey light of Thursday morning touched the windows. He placed it on the mantelpiece in the parlour where the camp had been. It stood looking over the empty space where his family had huddled, a silent, wooden witness. The act felt complete. The vigil was formally ended. The house had a new keeper. When the family gathered for breakfast, the presence of the little carved horse did not need explanation. It simply was. William touched its smooth back with a solemn finger. It was an anchor, a marker in time. The blizzard was now an event they had shared, survived, and begun to craft into legend. And with that legend taking shape outside of themselves, they could finally begin to let go of the tight coil of alertness. They could look forward to a night of sleep not defined by the storm but merely following a day of work in a recovering city. The greatest luxury, they were discovering, was not warmth alone, but the return of uneventful rest. Thursday morning, March 15th, dawned with a clarity so sharp it hurt the eyes. A sun, pale gold and defiant, hung in a sky of flawless blue. It shone upon a city that was no longer a raging white fury, but a stunned, glittering ruin. The silence was now the silence of aftermath, broken by thousands of points of sound. The distant shout of diggers, the bark of a dog, the relentless drip, drip, drip of melting icicles from every eave. The Hendersons, after a night in their separate, slowly thawing bedrooms, assembled in the kitchen. The world outside their window was no longer a sealed tomb, but a massive logistical puzzle. And with the puzzle came a new communal purpose, one that would shape the sleep to come: shared labour. Thomas finished his coffee, the real, precious coffee saved for this first morning of the new era. "Today," he said, his breath no longer pluming in the air, "we help the Connollys." The Connollys were an elderly couple 3 doors down. Mr. Connolly had a bad leg. Their son was away upstate. They had no one to dig them out. This simple statement framed the day. Survival had been personal. Recovery was communal. They dressed in layers, scarves wound high, hats pulled low. The cold was still intense, a dry, reflective cold that bounced off the endless snow. Stepping out of their front door canyon onto the street was like emerging onto the surface of the moon. The scale of the devastation was breathtaking. Streets were narrow passes between sheer cliffs of ploughed snow. Abandoned trolleys and wagons were half submerged. People moved like climbers on a glacier, along precarious packed trails. The work at the Connollys was hard but straightforward. Thomas and a few other neighbourhood men attacked the drift sealing their door, while Eleanor and Clara, armed with a smaller shovel and a bucket, began the tedious work of clearing their front steps and path. William's job was to stamp down the cleared snow to make a firmer path. The sun shone, but it gave little warmth. It was a brilliant cold eye witnessing the clean-up. Physical labour, in the freezing air, under the immense white silence, produced a unique kind of fatigue. It was a fatigue that went bone deep, that settled in the shoulders and the lower back, that made the lungs burn with each cold, sharp breath. There was no room for anxiety or fretful thought. The mind focused entirely on the next shovelful, the next step. It was, in its way, meditative. By midday, the Connollys' door was free, and the old couple emerged, wrapped in shawls, their gratitude profound. Mrs. Connolly pressed a jar of pickles into Eleanor's hands, a humble, priceless currency in the barter economy of the snowbound. The neighbourhood, once a collection of separate households, was becoming an organism. News travelled along the shovel lines. A baby had been born on Tuesday night, with only a neighbour midwife in attendance. A grocer on the next block was opening, selling what he could from his frost-damaged stock. Someone had a working telephone line. This flow of information was a lifeline. It replaced the severed telegraph wires. It told them they were part of a larger story of resilience, and it gave them a new framework for their exhaustion. They were not just tired from digging, they were tired from rebuilding. There was honour in it. That evening the Hendersons returned to their home, muscles aching, cheeks stung red by the cold. They were desperately weary, but it was a clean, satisfied weariness. The parlour, once their command centre, felt oddly empty, a memorial to the crisis past. They ate a simple meal, their appetites ravenous. The conversation was no longer about the storm's terror, but about the day's small victories. We cleared the Connollys' path. We heard the O'Malleys had their chimney fire put out by neighbours. Young Billy Harris dug out 6 families on his street. This narrative of community action was the final, crucial ingredient for the return of true, peaceful sleep. The individual's struggle had been sublimated into a collective effort. The fear of isolation had been conquered not just by family huddling, but by proving connection was possible, even through 10-foot drifts. As they prepared for bed, the rituals were simpler. The stoneware bottles were still used, but more out of habit than dire need. The extra layers of clothing were shed. They slept in their regular night clothes. The doors between their rooms were left ajar, not for warmth, but for the comfort of connection, a symbolic thread from the family bed. Clara climbed into her bed. The sheets were cool, but not frigid. The memory of the day's sun, the glare on the snow, the burn in her arms from shoveling played behind her eyelids. But instead of churning, it settled into a sense of solid accomplishment. Her body was tired in a way that demanded surrender. The sounds from the street were no longer the wind's scream, but the occasional call of a passer-by, the crunch of a foot on the packed snow path. They were the sounds of a world mending. She thought of the Connollys, warm in their dugout house because of their work. She thought of the little wooden horse on the mantel, standing guard over an empty space. The vigil was over. The watch had been passed to the community, to the sun, to the slow, inevitable melt. Her father's carving had done its job. It held the memory so she didn't have to. That night, across the buried districts of the Northeast, a generation of children, farmers, clerks, and society matrons slept the deepest sleep of their lives. It was the sleep of physical exhaustion redeemed by purpose. It was the sleep that follows a shared ordeal, when the mind knows, on a primal level, that the tribe is safe, the work was good, and the fire, for tonight at least, can be trusted to tend itself. It was not the sleep of escape, but the sleep of earned peace, under a sky finally clear of storm, where the only thing falling was the gentle, forgiving drip of the thaw. The world began to return in pieces, like fragments of a dream reassembling itself. Friday, March the 16th, brought the sound of bells. Not church bells, but the clear iron clang of the first streetcars, running on cleared avenues. It was a sound so ordinary it was now extraordinary. It spoke of systems, of order, of a giant machine groaning back to life. For the Hendersons, hearing it from their kitchen was like hearing the first heartbeat of a patient pronounced out of danger. But with the return of the outside world came its demands. Thomas had to think of his job at the shipping office. Eleanor's mind turned to the nearly empty larder. The children, though still thrilled by the adventure, missed their friends and the routine of school. The cocoon of the storm was fully breached, yet the transition was jarring. The body and mind, having adapted to a simplified, survival-focused existence, now had to re-engage with complexity. This re-entry posed a new challenge to sleep. The burden of anticipation. The anxiety of the storm had been immediate and physical. The anxiety of recovery was mental and logistical. When would the trains run? Would his position be held? How much would coal cost now? Could they afford the repairs to the fence the ice had shattered? These thoughts buzzed like flies at the edge of consciousness, threatening the hard-won peace of the previous night. Eleanor, sensing this new tension, as they ate a sparse lunch of soup and the last of the bread, initiated a ritual. She brought a small chalkboard from the children's school area into the kitchen. "Right," she said in her quartermaster's voice. "The storm is over, but we are not yet back to normal. We have a new campaign, the return, and every campaign needs a plan." At the top she wrote, "Objectives for the coming days." Then, in clear, simple script, inventory supplies, Thomas to ascertain office status, secure fresh food and milk, assess any house damage, re-establish daily rhythms. The act of writing it down was transformative. The vague, swirling worries were captured, pinned to the board, and given boundaries. They were no longer formless monsters in the mind. They were tasks on a list. This was the cognitive counterpart to Thomas's physical shoveling. It was digging a path through mental drifts. "And," Eleanor added, drawing a line, "we must not lose what we gained." She wrote a second, smaller list. What the blizzard taught us. The family bed is a strength. Vigilance in turns. Stories are fuel. Rest is a tool. This final list was the most important. It was a conscious act of preserving the wisdom of the crisis. They were naming the adaptations not as desperate measures, but as skills. By honouring them, they could integrate them into normal life, not as emergency protocols, but as a deeper layer of resilience. That afternoon, Thomas ventured out beyond the neighbourhood for the first time. The city was a spectacle of both ruin and heroic effort. Mountains of filthy snow lined the streets, melting from within, creating rivers of grey slush in the gutters. Work gangs of men, some paid, many volunteers, attacked the drifts with shovels and horse-drawn ploughs. The sound was a new symphony. The scrape of steel on stone, the slushy splash, the calls of coordination, the snort of overworked horses. He saw stores open, their windows steamy, queues of people waiting, patiently outside. The mood was not one of panic, but of determined, weary repair. He walked to his office building. It was dark, locked. A note was pinned to the door, closed until Monday by order. All accounts will be held. A wave of relief washed over him. The machine was paused for everyone. He was not behind. The world itself was catching its breath. He turned for home, his step lighter. One of the buzzing worries on the chalkboard could be checked off. Meanwhile, Eleanor and the children conducted the supply inventory. It was a sobering count. A little flour, some dried beans, a corner of salt pork, a few wrinkled potatoes. But it was knowledge, and knowledge was power. They knew what they faced. Clara wrote the items in her careful handwriting on a separate piece of paper, titled Larder, March 16th. The act of recording it made it manageable. As dusk fell, the Hendersons gathered around the chalkboard. Thomas reported his news. They discussed the food situation calmly. They agreed that tomorrow they would all go together to the nearest open grocer as an expedition. The plan was in motion. The unknowns were being corralled. That night the preparation for sleep was lighter. The stoneware bottles were filled, but with a sense of tradition rather than necessity. The doors were left ajar, but there was a new element. The chalkboard, left in the kitchen, visible from the parlour. In the firelight its lists seemed not like demands, but like a map. They had charted their worries. They had named their lessons. The path forward, though messy and slush-filled, was drawn. Clara lay in bed, thinking not of the wind, but of the chalky smell of the board, the smooth feel of the chalk in her hand as she wrote potatoes. Her mind was orderly. The buzzing had quieted. The blizzard had taught her that sleep required a handing over of responsibility, to a parent on watch, to a carved wooden horse, to a list on a board. You had to trust that the sentinel, whether human, symbolic, or written, was standing guard, so that your mind could furl its own sails and drift into the quiet harbour of the night. The storm outside was gone. Now the skill was to quiet the storm within, and they were learning one chalk stroke at a time. Saturday dawned with the peculiar slushy warmth of a rapid thaw. The brilliant hard cold was breaking. The air smelled of wet wool, melting ice, and the underlying unmistakable scent of the city re-emerging, horse manure, coal smoke, and damp brick. The Hendersons' expedition to the grocer was their first major foray back into the wider world. They dressed for mud, not snow. The journey was a revelation. Their neighbourhood canyon paths fed into main thoroughfares, where the snow had been pushed into towering, grimy berms. The streets ran with rivulets of meltwater. The sounds were a cacophony after days of muffled silence, the squelch of boots, the shouted conversations, the rumble of heavy drays hauling away snow, the clatter of reopened shops. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault. The queue outside Murphy's grocery stretched halfway down the block. It moved with a slow, patient rhythm. Here was the new communal space, not the family hearth, but the line for sustenance. News and rumours flowed faster than the water in the gutters. They're saying the trains might run by Tuesday. A fellow on 28th Street lost his whole roof from the wait. The milk delivery won't be regular for a week. The shared experience of the blizzard created an instant camaraderie. Strangers exchanged tips on keeping pipes from bursting, on which Baker had bread. After an hour's wait, they reached the dim, crowded interior of Murphy's. The shelves were half bare, but there was food. Tins of corned beef, sacks of rice, jars of preserves, and a small, precious crate of withered apples. Prices were higher. Eleanor counted her coins carefully, prioritising. She bought rice, beans, a tin of milk, a small sack of flour, and 2 apples as a treat. It was not a feast, but it was a promise of continuity. The walk home, their bags heavy with the moral weight of secured supplies, felt triumphant. They had engaged with the world and procured its bounty. But the excitement was tinged with a new exhaustion. The exhaustion of crowds, of negotiation, of re-immersion. William, overstimulated, became fractious. Clara felt a headache pulsing behind her eyes from the noise. Even Thomas was quiet, his face thoughtful. This was the next phase of post-blizzard life. The exhaustion of reconnection. The body and mind, having grown accustomed to the simplified, intense focus of survival, and then the clean fatigue of physical labour, now had to process a flood of social and sensory input. It was draining in a different, more diffuse way. That afternoon, the Hendersons retreated. The house, which had felt confining days before, now felt like a sanctuary from the messy, noisy, slushy reality outside. They closed the front door on the world of effort and sat in the quiet parlour. No one spoke much. Eleanor mended a sock. Thomas read a newspaper from before the storm, its news now quaint and irrelevant. The children played a quiet game of cards on the rug. This quiet time was not idleness. It was necessary processing. Their minds were digesting the morning's experiences, filing away the new information, adjusting their internal maps of the world from a white, silent void to a brown, noisy, recovering city. Without this quiet period, the overstimulation would have followed them into the night, manifesting as restless, chaotic dreams. As evening drew in, Eleanor prepared a simple meal from their new supplies, rice and beans with a bit of the salt pork. It was hot, filling, and tasted of security. The conversation at the table was soft, revolving around small, immediate things. The clever way Mr. Murphy had used cheesecloth to cover his produce, the funny hat a lady in the queue was wearing to keep off the drip from the eaves, the rhythm of the day, expedition, retreat, quiet processing, simple meal, was a perfect template for sleep. It mirrored the ancient hunter-gatherer pattern: exertion, return to the shelter, sharing of the bounty, rest. The body understood this rhythm on a cellular level. When bedtime came, the rituals were almost nostalgic. The hot water bottles were filled, the familiar goodnights were said. Clara climbed into her bed, her body tired from the walk and the standing, her mind gently buzzing with the images of the day: the long line, Mr. Murphy's kind eyes, the slushy streets. But the buzz was the buzz of a day fully lived, not of anxiety. She thought of the rice and beans, now part of her, fueling her sleep. She thought of her family, quiet in the parlour, a unit that had gone out into the world and returned intact. The sounds from the street were no longer the wind or the eerie silence, but the occasional late cart, the voices of other families settling in. They were the sounds of a collective bedtime for a wounded city. The great shared ordeal was creating a shared rhythm of recovery. As Clara drifted off, she felt not alone in her room, but part of a vast, weary, hopeful congregation, all turning out their lights, all seeking the same restorative dark. The blizzard had scattered them into isolated caves of survival. Now, the thaw was gathering them back into a community, and their simultaneous surrender to sleep was its first, unanimous prayer. Sunday, March the 18th, 1 week after the storm began, arrived with a sense of fragile normalcy. The sun was warmer, the drip from the rooftops a constant, cheerful patter. Church bells rang out across the city, not in alarm, but in their ancient summoning rhythm. For many, the decision to attend was not merely spiritual but social, a need to see the wider flock, to confirm survival, to give thanks in a collective voice. The Hendersons dressed in their best, which felt stiff and formal after days of woolens and layers. Walking to the church, they navigated a landscape in transition. The monstrous drifts were shrinking, collapsing in on themselves, revealing the buried detritus of the storm: a lost glove, a child's sled, the crumpled skeleton of a newspaper. The streets were rivers of brown slurry. The world was not clean, but it was awake. The church was packed, warmer than it had been in months from the press of bodies. The scent of wet wool, damp stone, and candle wax filled the air. The minister's sermon did not speak of gentle psalms, but of Noah, of trial, of endurance, and of the covenant signified by the clearing sky. He spoke of the neighbours who had shared coal, the men who had dug out strangers, the families who had sheltered passers-by. He named the blizzard not as God's wrath, but as a forge that had tested and strengthened the bonds of community. "We have kept watch over one another," the minister intoned, his voice echoing in the silent, attentive space. "We have learned that our own hearth is warmed by the knowledge that our neighbour's hearth also burns, and in that keeping we have earned our rest." The phrase struck Thomas Henderson, "earned our rest." It framed the profound sleep of the past week not as collapse, but as a sacrament. It was a reward for vigilance, for labour, for charity. The collective "M" that rumbled through the congregation felt like a seal on that idea. After the service, the church steps became a buzzing forum. The formalized sharing of peace extended into long conversations. People compared stories not with panic, but with a kind of solemn pride. We slept in the kitchen for 3 nights. We took in the Millers when their roof leaked. My boy helped dig out the fire station. The narratives were being polished into heirlooms. In this sharing, the individual family's ordeal was woven into the broader tapestry of the community's saga. This, too, was a release. The story was no longer a private, heavy burden to carry. It was a shared song. Returning home, the Hendersons felt a lightness. The psychological residue of the storm was being ceremonially cleansed. The afternoon was spent in quiet, Sabbath-appropriate rest. But this rest felt different from the strategic nap of Wednesday or the exhausted collapse of Saturday. It was a rest of integration, of settling the newly affirmed community story into their bones. As evening approached, Eleanor suggested something they hadn't done since before the blizzard, a proper bath. It was an operation involving kettles of water heated on the stove, the hip tub brought before the parlour fire, and a strict order of seniority. But it was a ritual of profound normalcy and purification. To wash away the literal grit of the thaw and the metaphorical grit of the crisis was to prepare the body for a new kind of sleep. Clara, her skin scrubbed pink and her hair damp at the ends, felt a layer of the experience slough away. The smell of coal smoke and fear that seemed to have clung to her was replaced by the simple, clean scent of soap. Wearing a fresh nightgown, she felt like a new person, or perhaps the old person restored. That night, the pre-sleep atmosphere in the house was one of serene completion. The carved wooden horse on the mantel watched over a room that was once again a parlour, not a camp. The chalkboard in the kitchen still held its lists, but they seemed less urgent, more historical. The stoneware bottles were warmed and placed in the beds, but they were now a comfort, not a lifeline. Clara lay in the dark, listening. The drip-drip outside was the sound of the storm unmaking itself, retreating back into the earth and the sky. The occasional distant whistle of a railway switchyard, a sound that had been absent for a week, was the sound of the machine of the world tentatively restarting. Her body was clean, her mind was quiet, her family was safe, and her community, she knew, was doing the same thing all around her, settling, releasing, trusting. This was the sleep of benediction. It was the deep, quiet sleep that follows a ceremony, where the trials of the past are formally acknowledged and laid to rest. The blizzard had been their shared liturgy, a violent, terrifying liturgy of wind and cold. Now, the calm, the church bells, the shared stories, and the warm bath were the rites of closure. They had kept the watch. They had told the tale. They had washed clean. Now they could sleep with the unshakable peace of those who have not just survived, but have been woven more deeply into the fabric of their world. The great, white, silent burden was lifted, and in its place was a gentle, collective exhalation, heard in the sigh of 1,000 children falling asleep at once, in a city finally at rest. The return to routine was not a switch being flipped, but a slow, persistent dawn. Monday, March the 19th, marked the true end of the storm's parenthesis. Thomas Henderson put on his proper suit and hat, kissed his family, and stepped out into the slushy world to return to his shipping office. The walk was longer than usual, detouring around still-blocked side streets, but the sight of other men and women in business attire all navigating the same messy paths was a powerful reinforcement of normalcy. The office was cold, the air stale. His colleagues arrived one by one, each bearing the same slightly dazed yet resilient expression. The greetings were not the usual perfunctory nods. They were solid handshakes, earnest inquiries about families and homes. The first hour was not spent on accounts but on the shared narrative. Maps were spread out, not of trade routes, but of the city, as they pointed out where they were stranded, what they saw, who they helped. The storm had become the ultimate icebreaker, levelling hierarchies in a shared experience of vulnerability and grit. Meanwhile, at home, Eleanor faced her own return to routine. The house felt emptier, larger, and strangely quiet without the central, urgent purpose of the camp. The chores, the dusting, the sweeping, the mending, felt both trivial and profound. Trivial compared to the life and death calculus of fuel and food. profound because they were the stitches sewing the fabric of ordinary life back together. She aired out the last of the blankets from the parlour, folding them away with a finality that felt ceremonial. She took the chalkboard, erased the lists of objectives, and returned it to the children's corner. The crisis management was over. For Clara and William, the day was one of odd dislocation. With no school yet reopened, they were at loose ends. The intense, family-centric world of the past week had vanished, leaving a vacuum. They tried to play, but their games kept drifting back to themes of storms, digging, and camps. They were, unconsciously, replaying the trauma to master it. Eleanor, wise to this, did not redirect them. Instead, she provided materials. She gave Clara paper and pencils to draw the scenes she remembered. She gave William blocks to build and then topple snowdrifts. They were creating their own artifacts, their own wooden horses. This processing through play was a vital sleep aid for children. It externalized the vivid, sometimes frightening images locked in their minds, translating them into something they could control and shape. By directing the narrative of the storm in their drawings and games, they drained it of its passive terror. A nightmare experienced is overwhelming. A nightmare recounted even in crayon becomes a story you own. As afternoon faded, the family reconvened. Thomas returned, bringing news of the wider world. The railways were making progress. The telegraph lines were being restored. The city's government was finally organising central snow removal. The information was no longer lifeline news. It was administrative news. The shift was significant. They were moving from survivors to citizens again. That evening's meal was the most normal yet. A proper cooked dinner with their procured supplies, eaten at the dining table, not by the fire. The conversation turned hesitantly to topics beyond the blizzard. Thomas mentioned a ship due from Liverpool. Clara talked of a book she hoped to read when school reopened. The storm was becoming a reference point, not the sole subject. This gradual return to mundane concerns was the final stage of psychological recovery. It allowed the mind to stretch back into its former shapes, to make room for future anxieties and future joys. The blizzard's shadow was receding, and the ordinary contours of life were re-emerging. When bedtime arrived, the rituals were almost entirely back to their pre-blizzard state. There was no special watch, no strategic placement of bedding. The stoneware bottles were used, but with a sense of luxury, not necessity. As Clara lay in bed, she thought about her father's office, her mother's cleaning, her own drawings. The storm was in the past. Its lessons, the warmth of the family bed, the comfort of a story, the importance of a plan, were folded into her like the blankets now stored in the linen press. They were part of her now, a hidden layer of resilience, but they no longer needed to be on the surface. The sounds of the night were the familiar sounds of a city at rest. A distant train whistle, a sound that would forever, for her generation, carry the echo of its absence. The muffled clop of a late horse, the sigh of the house settling. The great white silence was gone, replaced by the gentle, reassuring hum of ordinary life resuming. And in that hum, sleep was no longer an act of defiance or a strategic retreat. It was simply sleep. The deepest, most peaceful kind of all, the sleep that comes when the extraordinary has been safely catalogued and the ordinary is once again a gift. The true measure of the storm's passage was not just in clearing streets, but in the return of sound. By Tuesday, March 20th, the soundtrack of the city had been largely restored. The rhythmic clang-clang of the streetcars was constant. The cry of newsboys, shouting not about the blizzard, but fresh mundane headlines, echoed on corners. The jingle of harnesses, the rumble of drays loaded with debris, the calls of vendors. It was a symphony of reclamation. For the Hendersons, living just blocks from a major avenue, this noise, once tuneless background, was now a welcome chorus. It was the sound of the machine working, of life pushing forward with determined noise. Yet within the walls of their home, a new deeper quiet had taken root. It was not the fearful, muffled quiet of the snow tomb, nor the tense, listening quiet of the storm's peak. It was the quiet of a family that had shared a profound secret. They moved through their daily routines, Thomas to work, Eleanor to her chores, the children to their makeshift lessons and play, with a new, unspoken understanding. A glance across the dinner table could convey a universe of meaning, a memory of huddling for warmth, of the taste of shared cocoa, of the sound of a carving knife in the deep night. This internal quiet fostered a new quality of evening. There was less need for filled silence. They could sit together in the parlour, Thomas reading his paper, Eleanor darning, the children playing a quiet game without feeling the need to speak. The companionship was in the shared space, in the synchronized rhythm of their breathing, in the simple, profound fact of their collective presence. This comfortable silence was a direct offspring of the blizzard. When you have spent days interpreting every creak and groan for survival, the luxury of ignoring sound, of letting it be mere background, is immense. On this Tuesday evening, Eleanor brought out a small project. It was the quilt she had been mending. But she had added something. Using scraps of fabric, a grey wool from an old coat, a white muslin from a discarded petticoat, a bit of black thread, she had embroidered a simple stylist scene in one corner, a tiny house with a curl of smoke from its chimney, under a sky filled with delicate swirling stitches of white. She said nothing, simply smoothing the quilt over her lap and continuing her work. Clara noticed first. She crept over and touched the embroidery with a reverent finger. "It's our house," she whispered. "In the snow," William added, peering over her shoulder. Eleanor nodded, a small smile on her lips. "So we remember." This act, the encoding of memory into an everyday object, was the final, domestic alchemy. The quilt would cover them on future ordinary nights. It would be a functional, warm object. But now it also carried the hidden story, a tactile whisper of the time they became a fortress. It was a comfort that would work subliminally, a layer of warmth that was both physical and emotional. Thomas watched from his chair, his pipe sending up thoughtful curls of smoke. He saw the little wooden horse on the mantel, the embroidered quilt on his wife's lap, the drawings of snowdrifts pinned to the kitchen wall by the children. Their home was becoming a museum of their resilience, a gallery of gentle artifacts. These objects were guardians, yes, but they were also releases. They held the memory so the people didn't have to cling to it so tightly. They externalized the experience, allowing it to settle into history rather than linger as active trauma. That night's sleep preparation was a study in this new, layered normalcy. The rituals were pre-blizzard: washing faces, brushing hair, saying prayers. But beneath the surface, the lessons of the storm were embedded. Clara hugged her parents a moment longer. William checked that his door was ajar, not for heat, but for connection. Eleanor placed the newly embroidered quilt at the foot of their bed, where Thomas's feet would touch it. As Clara lay in the dark, the city's noises were a lullaby. The occasional streetcar bell was a reminder that the world was turning, reliably, predictably. The distant whistle of a train was a promise of distances bridged, of isolation defeated. She thought of the quilt, of the tiny embroidered smoke from the tiny house. It was a signal fire stitched in thread. It said, "We are here, we are warm, we remember." Sleep came not as a surrender to exhaustion, but as a gentle agreement with the night. The body and mind, having been to the edge and back, now understood the value of the quiet centre. The blizzard had been a masterclass in contrast. It had taught them the true shape of warmth by outlining it in cold, the true sound of peace by preceding it with roar. Now, in its aftermath, ordinary sleep was revealed for what it always was: a miracle of safety, a luxury of calm, a deeply earned and now fully appreciated gift. The great wind had scrubbed their appreciation clean, and now, in the quiet, they could hear the soft, infinitely precious sound of their own hearts beating steady and slow in the safe dark. The world beyond their neighbourhood began to seep back in through the restored veins of communication. On Wednesday, a letter arrived for Eleanor, postmarked from Boston and bearing the familiar handwriting of her sister. It was wrinkled, water-stained, and over a week late, but its arrival was an event. They gathered around the kitchen table as she opened it with careful hands. The letter was mundane, full of pre-storm news of children's coughs and a new recipe for pound cake. Its ordinary concerns from a time before the cataclysm were jarring yet deeply comforting. It was a thread connecting them to a timeline that had continued unbroken elsewhere. Eleanor wrote a lengthy reply that evening, her pen scratching steadily in the quiet parlour. She did not lead with the drama, but woven through the news of William's lost tooth and Clara's, reading progress was the quiet report. We came through the great blizzard unscathed. We were very close for a time and very warm in our hearts. The children were splendid. It was the distillation of their experience into a language fit for the outside world, understated, resilient, proud. Similarly, Thomas brought home a newspaper, one of the first to be printed with full reports from beyond Manhattan. The articles spoke of the storm's broader wrath, ships driven aground on Long Island, entire towns isolated in Connecticut, heroic tales of telegraph operators who had stayed at their posts until the lines went dead. Reading it, the Hendersons realized their ordeal was not unique, but a single stanza in a vast national epic. This knowledge was paradoxically relaxing. Their fear, their strategies, their endurance were part of a collective response. They had not been alone in their dark parlour. They had been one cell in a vast organism struggling to maintain its heat. This broadening of perspective, from the intensely personal to the communal, and now to the regional, had a profound effect on their sleep. The weight of the event, which had felt so singular and heavy, began to disperse. It was becoming history, a chapter in a shared story. The mind could file it away, not as a personal, ongoing trauma, but as a participated in event. That night, after the children were in bed, Thomas and Eleanor sat by the fire, not out of need for warmth, but for the continuity of the ritual. They talked in low voices, not about the storm's details, but about its aftermath in this new, broader context. "They say the train to Chicago may run by week's end," Thomas murmured, staring into the flames. "And the Connellys' son will be able to get home," Eleanor replied, thinking of the old couple. "I saw Mrs. Ahern today. Her brother in Albany sent a telegraph. Just the word 'safe.' It cost him $1, she said, but it was worth 1,000. They were quiet for a moment, listening to the fire pop, a sound that would forever be the sound of safety to them. "We should plant something," Eleanor said suddenly. "When the ground thaws properly, something hardy. A lilac bush, perhaps." Thomas looked at her, understanding. It was an act of faith in a future they had helped ensure. It was a gesture of growth after the burying. He nodded. "A lilac. Good. They smell strongest after a hard winter." This conversation, planning for a fragrant future, was the ultimate signal of moving on. The storm was being integrated, not as an end, but as a turning point. Their sleep that night was infused with this sense of continuity. The blizzard was not a full stop, it was a comma. Life, with its recipes and train schedules and planting plans, was resuming its sentence. Clara, half asleep in her room, heard the soft murmur of her parents' voices through the floor register. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was calm, forward-looking. It was the sound of the captains in the aftermath, surveying the settled sea, charting the next course. It was more soothing than any lullaby. It told her, in a language deeper than words, that the watch was truly over. The adults were no longer planning for the next hour of cold, but for the next season of blooms, and in that certainty, a child's world feels profoundly safe. She turned over, her hand finding the now familiar coolness of the recovered stoneware bottle, and slipped into a dream not of white landscapes, but of deep purple blossoms, heavy with scent, under a warm, steady sun. Thursday brought the sound of children's laughter from the street, a sound absent for over a week. Schools had reopened. The sight of Clara and William buttoning into coats, slinging book bags over shoulders, was so ordinary it felt monumental. Eleanor stood at the door watching them join a small stream of the other children navigating the shrinking snow mountains, their voices bright and chattering like released birds. The neighbourhood was giving back its young. The return to school was a powerful normalizer, but it also served as a key site for the social processing of the blizzard. In Clara's classroom, the first hour was not given to arithmetic or spelling. The teacher, Miss Evans, whose own face bore the traces of a weary vigil, asked simply, "Would anyone like to share about the past week?" A cascade of stories followed. A boy told of his father digging a tunnel to the neighbours to share a newspaper. A girl spoke of sleeping with her rabbit in a basket by the stove. Another told of the eerie blue light inside a snow-drifted window. Clara, usually shy, found herself raising her hand. "We had a family bed in the parlour," she said softly, "and my father carved a wooden horse to stand guard so we could sleep." Miss Evans listened to each, validating them with a nod. She did not correct the dramatic embellishments of the younger ones. Instead, she said, "You have all lived through an important piece of history, You have stories that your own grandchildren will ask to hear. You know now what you and your families are made of." Then she seamlessly turned to a geography lesson, pointing out on a map the path of the storm, showing how the air from Canada met the moisture from the ocean. The personal was being connected to the scientific, the emotional to the factual. This too was a form of integration. The terrifying mystery was being explained, its power demystified by understanding. William's kindergarten experience was more visceral. They were given paper and paints and told to paint the storm. The resulting artworks were a chaotic, wonderful mess of swirling white and grey, with small, bright squares of yellow for windows and stick-figure families clustered inside. The act of physically pushing paint around to represent the chaos was a therapeutic release for small bodies that had felt so powerless. They were externalizing the monster, making it something they could create and therefore control. The children returned home that afternoon not just with lessons, but with a new, shared lexicon of experience. They compared their classmates' stories with their own, finding commonalities and differences. Their personal family ordeal was now part of a peer-reviewed narrative. It was being socialized, stripped of some of its solitary intensity. It was becoming simply the time of the big snow. That evening, the dinner table conversation was dominated by these shared stories. For the first time, the blizzard talk was animated, almost giddy, as Clara and William tripped over each other to report. And Michael O'Brien said they ate nothing but boiled potatoes for 3 days. Susie's mother had a baby right in the storm. The tales were becoming folklore even to them. This socialization of the trauma was a critical final step for sleep. A private fear can haunt the dark. A fear that is shared, compared, and even laughed about in the retelling loses its spectral power. It becomes a story, and stories end. The mind can close the book on them. As bedtime approached, the routine was blissfully unchallenged. Homework was done, a paragraph about what I did during the snow. Faces were washed, prayers were said. But when Clara climbed into bed, she did something new. She took the small drawing she had made at school, a picture of their brownstone with smoke curling from the chimney, under a sky of furious swirls, and pinned it to the wall beside her bed. It was her artifact, her contribution to the family museum. She looked at it, then at her room, the ordinary familiar space. The drawing was a window into the past, but she was firmly in the present. The sounds from the street were the sounds of a returned world, a mother calling a child in, the rhythmic beat of a horse pulling a late delivery, the faint, happy exhaustion in her parents' voices from downstairs. The blizzard was now a thing to be drawn and discussed and placed on a wall. It had a frame around it, and within the safe, warm frame of her room, with the even breath of her brother across the hall, sleep was just sleep, deep, untroubled, and rich with the quiet pride of a story fully told and a world faithfully regained. The weekend arrived, and with it the first true day of spring warmth. The sun, no longer just a brilliant cold eye, had gained a gentle strength. It softened the remaining snowbanks, turned the streets into shallow lakes of meltwater, and drew people outside like flowers turning to the light. The Hendersons decided on a walk, not for necessity, but for pleasure and assessment. The city was a spectacle of messy rebirth. Parks were half white, half brown, with children daring each other to cross dwindling snowfields. The mountains of ploughed snow, now charcoal grey with city grime, slumped in defeat. Workmen on ladders repaired broken gutters and signs. The air was full of the sounds of dripping, of conversation, of life being repaired. They walked without a strict destination, simply observing. They saw the evidence of the storm's violence. A porch roof collapsed, a fence smashed by a fallen tree limb, windows still boarded up. But they also saw the evidence of its conquered nature. Those same fallen limbs being sawed into firewood by neighbours, the boarded windows with signs promising glass coming Monday, the shared shovels leaning against stoops. Their walk led them to a small city square. In its centre, a statue of some forgotten dignitary was now adorned with a lopsided snowman, wearing a hat and scarf left by some anonymous whimsical soul. People smiled at it as they passed. It was a symbol of the human spirit's irrepressible urge to play, even on the shoulders of history and tragedy. As they stood there, Thomas pointed out a familiar figure, Mr. Connolly, the elderly neighbour they had dug out. He was sitting on a bench, his bad legs stretched out, soaking in the sun. His wife was beside him, knitting. They waved, and the Hendersons went over. "A fine day for a thaw," Mr. Connolly said, his face crinkling into a smile. "It is indeed," Thomas replied. "How are you faring?" "Oh, well enough. The boys due home on the train tomorrow. We'll be right as rain." He paused, looking out over the slushy square. "You know, I was a boy for the great snow of 1856. Buried us just as deep. Slept with my 5 brothers in the loft over the cows for warmth." He chuckled, a dry, papery sound. "Seems the world needs to remind us how to huddle up every generation or so." The comment landed with gentle weight. It placed their experience in a lineage. They were not alone in history. They were the latest link in a chain of people who had endured, huddled, and emerged. This connection to the past was deeply comforting. It normalized their experience. It was a rite of passage for a city, for a region. The walk home was quieter, filled with the warmth of the sun and the warmth of that connection. They were part of a continuum. The blizzard of 1888 would now join 1856 in the oral history, a story to be told on future winter nights. Their own children might one day say, "My parents were in the Great White Hurricane of '88, with the same mix of awe and casual ownership that Mr. Connolly had just displayed." That night, as the coolness of evening descended, still cool but no longer deadly, the Hendersons felt a collective, gentle loosening. The last tight coil of aftermath tension seemed to dissolve in the day's sun. The storm was no longer a recent raw wound. It was a scar, toughened over, a part of their story, but no longer dictating its plot. The pre-sleep rituals were now wholly nostalgic, even affectionate. The stoneware bottle at Clara's feet was a friend, not a tool. The open door to the hallway was a preference, not a strategy. When Eleanor came to tuck her in, she didn't just kiss her forehead. She smoothed her hair and said, "My brave girl." Lying in the dark, Clara thought of Mr. Connolly on the bench, of the snowman on the statue, of the long line of people who had slept in lofts over cows. Her own story felt smaller, but also larger, connected. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet pride. She had been part of something big. She had learned its lessons, and now she was simply a girl in her bed, in a city that had weathered a storm. The sounds from the open window were the sounds of a Saturday night gently winding down, a distant piano from a saloon, the laughter of a couple passing by, the endless sleepy drip of the final clinging ice. It was the sound of a world healed enough to be frivolous, to be ordinary. And in that ordinary, unremarkable soundscape, sleep was a gentle tide, rising slowly and warmly, carrying her into a dreamless, perfect dark. The watch was over, not just for her family but for her city, and for the generation that had just earned its place in the long unbroken story of winters survived. A week after the storm's end, the rhythms of life had not just returned, they had deepened. The Hendersons found themselves inhabiting their days with a new appreciation for mundane friction. The minor annoyances, a late streetcar, a queue at the butcher's, a draft under the door, no longer sparked the same frustration. They were the textures of a functioning world, and having lived without a world at all, each texture felt like a privilege. This newfound appreciation bred a profound evening fatigue, but it was a sweet fatigue. It was the tiredness that comes from a day fully engaged with life, not battling against it. Thomas came home from work with the pleasant ache of a mind applied to ledgers and logistics, the machinery of commerce now a symphony he was glad to hear. Eleanor's weariness was from the active management of a household returned to its full, bustling scope, planning meals with fresh, available food, airing out the last of the storm-damp linens, welcoming a neighbour for tea. The children, too, were tired in a new way. School was no longer a novelty but a demand. Their minds were stretching back into the disciplines of reading and sums, their bodies readjusting to the rigid schedules of bells and recess. This structured exhaustion was a gift. It was predictable, communal, and it pointed unequivocally towards rest. As Friday evening settled in, the family gathered in the parlour, not by necessity, but by unspoken choice. The room had reclaimed its identity as a place of leisure, but its memory as a citadel lent a sacred quality to their relaxation. Thomas lit the gas lamps, not just the fire, pushing back the darkness with a confident modern hiss. Eleanor brought in her mending basket. Clara read a book. William built a complex fortress with his blocks, its walls high and impregnable. The silence was rich and comfortable. They had shared so much words were sometimes superfluous. Yet it was William who broke the quiet, his voice thoughtful as he placed a final block on his tower. "Papa," he said, not looking up, "will there be another big snow?" The question hung in the lamplit air. It was the child's version of the adult's unspoken anxiety. Could this happen again? Thomas put down his paper. He considered. He could offer a platitude, but the blizzard had made truth more valuable than comfort. "Yes, William," he said gently. "There will be other big storms. Perhaps not next year, or even for many years. But yes, winter will always have teeth." William looked up, his small face serious. "But we know what to do now." The statement was not a question. It was a declaration. Thomas felt a surge of fierce, quiet pride. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "We know exactly what to do. We know to prepare. We know to come together. We know to keep watch in turns. And we know," he added, his gaze taking in Eleanor and Clara, "that our family is warmer than any storm is cold." This explicit acknowledgement of their hard-won competence was the final seal on the experience. They were not just survivors, they were experts. They had earned a diploma in resilience. The uncertainty of the future was not neutralized, but it was now armed with a proven blueprint. The family bed, the storytelling, the strategic rest, the shared watch. These were not one-time tricks. They were a permanent part of their repertoire. That night, the preparation for bed felt like a drill for a future, distant challenge, practiced with the calm confidence of veterans. Clara filled her own stoneware bottle from the kettle, handling the towel-wrapped hot ceramic with capable care. William checked the window latch, ensuring it was snug against the cool but not cold spring air. Their actions were no longer born of fear but of quiet, ingrained knowledge. When Clara slipped into bed, she didn't ponder the storm's return. Instead, she thought of the blueprint. She imagined it like a diagram in one of her school books, a cutaway of their house with arrows pointing to the parlour hearth, to the stored blankets, to the full water pitchers. It was a map of safety that existed in her mind, a living document. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a system, and she understood its workings. The sounds of the night were the sounds of a city fortified by experience. A new, sharper note had entered the chorus, the sound of hammers, as repairs continued into the evening by lantern light. It was not a sound of desperation, but of confident repair. The drip of melt had finally ceased. The last of the ice was gone. In its place was the soft, moist sigh of a city exhaling, the earth drinking the storm back in. Sleep came with the ease of trust. They trusted the blueprint. They trusted each other. They trusted the house, which had been tested and had held. The blizzard of 1888 had been a violent, unwanted teacher, but it had taught them the most valuable lesson a family can learn, that they are not just inhabitants of a home, but its stewards and its guardians, and that in that shared duty there is a warmth that no winter, no matter how great, can ever extinguish. The seasons turned with their slow, inevitable grace. The lilac bush Eleanor had suggested was planted in the small backyard, its roots settling into the thawed earth. By late April it showed tender green buds. The last grey, gritty remnants of the snow mountains vanished, washed away by spring rains, leaving behind only stories and a few physical scars on the city's face, fresh paint on repaired trim, new glass in windows, a collective subtle straightening of posture in its inhabitants. For the Hendersons, the memory of the blizzard receded from daily thought, but it settled into the foundation of their family life, like the coal dust that lingered in the cellar, unseen, but a fundamental part of the landscape. It surfaced in small ways, a preference for keeping the wood box unusually full, a shared smile when the first flurries of the next winter fell, harmless, pretty things, a newfound respect for the sturdy, ugly practicality of long underwear. One evening in early May, with the windows open to the mild, flower-scented air, the family received a visitor, Albert Post, the diarist from Newark, a distant cousin of Thomas's. He was in the city on business and had come to pay his respects. Over after-dinner coffee, the conversation, as it did with everyone that spring, turned to the storm. Mr. Post was a quiet man with observant eyes. "I have been writing it all down," he confessed. "Not just the facts, The depth of the snow, the temperature, but the other things, the quality of the silence, the way the candlelight looked on the children's faces as they slept, the sound of my own heart in the quiet. Eleanor nodded. We have our own records, a wooden horse, an embroidered quilt, some drawings. It is the human record that will matter, Mr. Post said thoughtfully. The meteorologists will have their charts, the newspapers their tallies of the dead and the cost. But it is the memory of how we lived through it, how we slept, how we kept the dark at bay, that will tell the real truth to those who come after. He asked if he might see their artifacts. Clara shyly brought her drawing from school. William showed the block tower he now called his storm fort. Thomas brought the little carved horse from the mantel. Eleanor unfolded the quilt, her fingers tracing the embroidered swirls of snow. Mr. Post examined each item with a reverence usually reserved for relics. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "You have built a cairn." They looked at him, puzzled. "In the wilderness," he explained, "travellers build cairns, piles of stone, to mark a trail, to show others the way or to commemorate a passage. Your horse, your quilt, your drawings, these are the stones of your cairn. You have marked the trail you took through that white wilderness, so you will never be lost in it again, and so others perhaps might learn from your path." The metaphor was beautiful and perfect. It reframed their keepsakes not as mere mementos, but as guideposts. They were not symbols of fear endured, but of a route mapped through fear. Later, after Mr. Post had left with promises to send a copy of his writings, the family sat in the twilight parlour. The lilac scent drifted in. The wooden horse was back on the mantel, standing sentinel over a room that needed no sentinel. "A cairn," Clara murmured, looking at her drawing on the wall. "Yes," Thomas said, "and our trail through that particular wilderness is over. The path is marked. We can look back and see the stones, but we don't have to walk it again." That night, the act of going to bed felt like leaving a well-marked trail behind and stepping onto open, familiar ground. The rituals were so ingrained they were nearly invisible. The house was secure, not against an imminent threat, but as a matter of course. The family was healthy, not clinging together for survival, but bound by a shared history that had deepened their bonds. As Clara lay in bed, she thought of cairns in the wilderness, piles of stone that said, "I was here, I made it through." She thought of her drawing, her stone in the pile. Her family's collective cairn was not a monument to the storm, it was a monument to their passage through it. It marked the point where fear turned into competence, isolation into unity, and watchfulness into peace. The sounds through her open window were the sounds of a peaceful spring night. Crickets, a distant foghorn on the river, the rustle of new leaves, they were the sounds of the world continuing beautifully relentlessly. The great white silence of 1888 was now just one stone in the long cairn of her life, and of the city's life. It was a stone that made all the other ordinary stones, the sound of crickets, the scent of lilac, the comfort of her bed, seem more precious, more vivid, more full of grace. And in that deep, grateful peace, sleep was not an end, but a gentle continuation of the safe, warm journey. Summer bloomed over the city in a riot of heat and noise that was the absolute antithesis of the blizzard's silent white grip. The streets, once canyons of snow, now shimmered with heat haze. The heavy odour of flowering lindens and horse sweat replaced the crystalline scent of ice. Children, including Clara and William, played outside until dusk, their cries of freedom a world away from the hushed whispers of the parlour camp. In this vibrant, demanding season, the specific lessons of the snowstorm seemed to recede, becoming dormant like bulbs in the earth. They were not forgotten, but they were not called upon. Sleep was easy, a matter of throwing off light sheets and seeking a breeze from the window. The stoneware bottles were stored in the cellar. The family bed was a memory evoked only during thunderstorms, when the children would sometimes pad into their parents' room, not for warmth, but for company against the booming sky. Yet, the deeper, structural changes remained. There was a noticeable economy of worry in the Henderson household. A broken window, a delayed paycheck, a childhood fever. These were met with a calm, methodical resolve that had been forged in the white furnace of March. The panic threshold had been permanently raised. They had faced the absolute negation of routine, the stopping of the world itself, and had managed. Thereafter, the smaller vicissitudes of life lost their power to terrify. This emotional resilience was the storm's most enduring gift, and it fostered a deeper, more secure sleep. There were no midnight frettings over trivialities. The mind, having been trained to conserve energy for true emergencies, now dismissed phantom anxieties with a veteran's disregard. One humid August evening, the family took a streetcar to the outskirts of the city to see a travelling carnival. It was a spectacle of garish lights, raucous music, and thrilling sensations, the Ferris wheel offering a dizzying view of the glittering, sprawling metropolis. As they rode the car home, sticky with spun sugar and weary from excitement, William fell asleep against Thomas's shoulder, and Clara's head nodded against the vibrating window. Watching them, their faces peaceful in the flickering gaslight of the streetcar, Thomas felt a profound wave of contentment. This was the other side of the coin. The blizzard had taught them how to hunker down, to conserve, to protect. But it had also, by contrast, taught them the incalculable value of this, of ordinary joy, of effortless movement through a warm night, of children sleeping trustfully amidst noise and light, secure in the knowledge that home and bed awaited. They carried the sleeping children inside, undressing them and tucking them into their beds with the tender efficiency of long practice. The house was warm from the day's sun, but a cross breeze made it comfortable. Eleanor and Thomas sat on the back step listening to the distant fading sounds of the city and the closer chirp of crickets. "They slept right through," Eleanor murmured, a smile in her voice. "They trust the carriage to get them home," Thomas replied. "They trust us to carry them to bed." He paused. "We built that trust in March, in the parlour." The connection was clear. The extreme dependency of the blizzard, the literal carrying of mattresses, the vigilant watch, had established a bedrock of reliability. Now, in ordinary times, that trust allowed for a surrender to sleep, or to a parent's shoulder on a streetcar, that was total and unthinking. The children's ability to sleep anywhere, through anything, was a direct dividend of the safety they had been so consciously shown when the world was at its most unsafe. That night, as Thomas lay beside Eleanor in the dark, the cacophony of the carnival still a faint echo in his ears, he thought about trust. The blizzard had been a brutal audit of their lives, testing every system, their home's integrity, their supply lines, their emotional bonds, their very will. They had passed, and because they had passed that ultimate test, the 1,000 minor tests of daily life no longer registered. The ledger was balanced, the audit complete. He slept a sleep free of accounting. There were no lists to review, no watches to plan, no fuel to calculate. There was only the gentle hum of the summer night, the soft breath of his wife, and the profound, unshakable knowledge that their family was a proven vessel, seaworthy in any storm and therefore perfectly at peace in the calm. The great sleep of the blizzard had been an active, hard-won state. This sleep was a passive, effortless gift, and he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would never take it for granted again. The first autumn chill arrived with a whisper, a crispness in the evening air that spoke of turning leaves and coming frost. For the Hendersons and for much of the Northeast, this was not just a seasonal shift, but the first return to the conditions of the memory. The cold was benign, even refreshing, but it carried an echo. It was the same species of cold that had, months before, been the advance guard of the monster. One Saturday in late October, Thomas announced it was time to bring up the storm windows from the cellar and lay in the coal for the winter. In years past, this had been a chore, a tedious heralding of the confined months ahead. This year it was a ritual infused with new meaning. They worked as a team, not with dread, but with the quiet competence of engineers preparing a trusted ship for a known sea. Clara and William helped clean the glass of the storm sashes before Thomas fitted them over the parlour windows. As they wiped away the summer's grime, they could see their own reflections and beyond the now familiar street in its autumn guise. They were looking at the world through the same glass that had once been a frozen, opaque barrier. The act of preparing it felt like an act of reconciliation with the season. When the coal wagon arrived, rumbling down the street, its black load was a promise, not a threat. Thomas supervised as the glossy, dusty cascade poured down the chute into their cellar bin. The sound was a deep, rumbling thunder, the opposite of the silent, desperate scraping of the last lumps from a near-empty scuttle. They were not just buying fuel, they were buying assurance. They were stockpiling nights of guaranteed warmth and therefore guaranteed peace. That night, as the temperature dipped below freezing for the first time that season, Thomas lit the first official hearth fire of autumn. It, was not needed for survival, but for ceremony. The family gathered around as they had so many times in desperation, but now in pure pleasure. The flames danced, the same flames that had been their tiny sun in a white universe. "It's the same fire," William observed, his face lit by the glow. "But we are not the same," Clara replied quietly, and her parents exchanged a glance of profound understanding. She was right. The fire was a tool they respected but did not fear. They were its masters, not its supplicants. As the evening wound down, Eleanor brought out a box. Inside were the items from their cairn: the little wooden horse, the embroidered quilt, the children's drawings. She didn't unwrap them fully, just rested a hand on the box. "Should we put these away?" she asked. "Or keep them out?" Thomas thought for a moment. "I think we put the horse on the mantel for the winter," he said. "Not as a guard, as a reminder of a job well done. The rest can be stored. We know where they are." This was the final stage of integration. The artifacts were not needed for daily comfort. Their power was absorbed. The horse could be a decoration, its symbolic duty retired. The knowledge it represented was now in their bones, in the full coal bin, in the well-fitted storm windows, in the calm way they sat around a fire without listening for a change in the wind's pitch. When they went to bed, the house had a different feel than it had in months. It was sealed, prepared, buttoned up against the cold with intention. Clara's room was snug, the storm window cutting the whisper of the wind to a distant sigh. She pulled up an extra blanket, not out of urgency, but from a place of seasoned choice. Lying there, she felt a circle completing. The cycle of the seasons had brought them back to the doorstep of winter, but they were not who they had been when they last crossed that threshold. They were not a family walking innocently into the cold. They were a family walking back into it with their eyes open, their supplies checked, and their blueprints in hand. The haunting was over. The blizzard was no longer a ghost in their halls. It was a chapter in their manual. The sleep that followed was the sleep of the prepared. It was deep and solid, untroubled by the minor creaks and groans of the cooling house. Those sounds were just the house settling into its winter posture, a language they now understood perfectly. The fear had been translated into knowledge, and knowledge, in the quiet of an autumn night, is the most powerful sleeping draught of all. They slept not in spite of the coming winter, but in harmony with it, having made their peace with its potential for fury, and in doing so, having reclaimed the profound peace of the frosty, silent, starlit nights that were its more common and beautiful gift. The first anniversary of the blizzard arrived not with a storm, but with a clear, cold, utterly ordinary March day. The city went about its business. The newspapers made brief retrospective mention of the Great White Hurricane, but the headlines were devoted to politics, to trade, to the mundane forward march of 1889. Life had, as life does, moved insistently on. In the Henderson household the day passed without ceremony. Thomas went to work, Clara and William went to school. Eleanor planned a menu for the week. Yet, as evening fell, a quiet, unspoken awareness hummed amongst them. It was in the way Thomas banked the fire with a little extra care that night. In the way Eleanor, after dinner, unfolded the embroidered quilt and draped it over the back of the parlour sofa. In the way Clara, without being asked, filled the stoneware bottles with hot water and brought them upstairs. They did not speak of the date. They didn't need to. Their actions were a silent, collective nod to the memory, a private toast to their own resilience. It was no longer a raw memory, but a part of their family's geology, a layer of strength deposited under pressure, now solid and foundational. After the children were in bed, Thomas and Eleanor sat in the parlour. The fire crackled in the same hearth. The little wooden horse stood on the mantel. The quilt lay nearby. The room was just a room, comfortable and lived in, but it was also a monument to a night, a week, when it had been the entire world. "A year," Eleanor said softly, her eyes on the flames. "A year," Thomas echoed. He reached over and took her hand. It was warm. "Do you ever think, what if we hadn't? What if the coal had run out? What if a tree had fallen?" "I don't," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Not anymore. We did. It didn't. We're here." She turned her hand to lace her fingers with his. "We learned how to sleep through a hurricane. I don't think anything will ever keep us awake again." Upstairs, Clara lay awake for a little while, listening. She heard the soft murmur of her parents' voices, a comforting drone of stability. She felt the warmth of the stoneware bottle at her feet. a tradition now, a comforting echo. She looked at her drawing on the wall, the swirls of crayon storm looking more like art than history. She thought about the stories they would tell in years to come. They would be polished by time, the sharp edges of fear worn smooth, leaving behind the core of the tale, the family bed, the carved horse, the shared watch. It would become a legend, their legend. And she realized that this was the final, most precious gift of the blizzard. It had given them a story of their own strength, a story to fall back on whenever life felt cold or frightening. She thought of her children, grandchildren she could not yet imagine, asking one day, "Grandma, what was the great blizzard like?" And she would tell them. She would tell them about the fortress in the parlour and the guardian horse, and how they all learned that the warmest place in any storm is the centre of your family. She would tell them how to sleep when the world is roaring, and in the telling the lesson would live on, long after the last person who remembered the snow had melted away into time. With that thought, a profound, gentle peace settled over her. The story was complete. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end was here, in this warm, safe bed, in this sturdy house, with the quiet voices of her parents rising like a soft benediction from below. She closed her eyes. Outside, a typical March wind brushed against the storm windows, a tame imitation of its former self. It was just the wind. It was just the night. And she was just a girl, drifting into a deep, untroubled and deeply earned sleep, in a world restored, in a home fortified, in a story finally, peacefully told. Thank you for journeying back to the great blizzard of 1888 with us. We hope this story of resilience, family, and the profound art of rest has brought you a sense of calm and peace. Did this historical lullaby help you unwind? We'd love to hear where in the world you listened, and what time you finally drifted off. Share your comments below. It connects our community of quiet historians across the globe. If you wish to return to this story, or discover other soothing narratives from the annals of time, please subscribe to Historical Truth. A simple click ensures you never miss a moment of peaceful history. Until next time, good night and sleep well.